Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. My guest is Ned Price. He is a former special assistant to President Obama and former CIA analyst. In the first segment, we talked about John Ratcliffe and Trump withdrawing his bid to nominate Ratcliffe for Director of National Intelligence. Now we'll talk in this segment about the intelligence behind the Russia investigation and whether, just like we saw with Ratcliffe, there is grounds for scrutiny there as well. When it comes to Russia's supposed attacks on our democracy, I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean Russia is attacking our democracy because they're accused of hacking emails and putting up social media? So I hear that term used a lot, but I'm not sure what we're actually supposed to, what that actually amounts to when it comes to its actual manifestation.
Well, I think we can talk about it most clearly in terms of what we saw in 2016 with Russia's campaign then, as the intelligence community and as other work associated with it has demonstrated. This was a multifaceted campaign that was ordered at the highest levels of the Russian government, including by Vladimir Putin himself. Yes, it involved the spreading of propaganda on social media by the Internet Research Agency and other so-called trolls. But it also involved the hack and release of emails, an operation that was undertaken by Russian military intelligence in conjunction with WikiLeaks, with DC Leaks, and with Guccifer 2.0, among others. And the third component of this was the multiple channels of outreach from Russian agents to members and associates of the Trump campaign that have been well documented in the Mueller report and elsewhere. So that's what it looked like in 2016. What Dan Coats put forward in his congressional testimony, in his written congressional testimony earlier this year in 2019, he said that we should expect the Russians to do much the same in 2020, but we could even see additional tactics that we didn't see in 2016. And there's been a lot of talk about so-called deep fakes, about manipulation of data. We know the Russians probed our electoral system in all 50 states, of course, didn't change any vote tallies or tamper with voter rolls, for example. But I don't think we can outright dismiss the possibility that they might try something like that.
So what I see is a bipartisan fear-mongering campaign. Take the example you gave about Russian agents reaching out to the Trump campaign. Who actually, in all this, was an actual Russian agent? I don't see any examples in the Mueller report of anybody actually acting on the Kremlin's behalf, except for two examples. You have the Russian ambassador, Kislyak, who met with some Trump people, and you have an assistant in the Kremlin spokesperson's office who spoke to Michael Cohen. But aside from that, the people who are portrayed as Russian agents, I see as either having no connections to the Kremlin, or in fact, in some cases, having deeper connections to the West.
Another one I would cite is Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was behind the Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016. She is described, even in the Trump team's own correspondence, as a Russian government attorney. And look, I think a mistake we often make in the West is essentially to replicate our understanding of our own system on the Russian system, where there is a clear separation of civilian and government officials. I think Russia is much less of a system where there is a clear dividing line between government officials and private citizens. I think someone like Natalia Veselnitskaya is a good example of that, someone who purportedly was an attorney, but who was, by the own account of the Trump team and documentation we've since seen, was acting at the behest of the Russian government as part of this multifaceted campaign.
Mueller never asserts that Veselnitskaya worked for the Russian government at the time of the Fusion GPS meeting. She previously worked for the Russian government, which the Mueller report does say, but that doesn't mean she was acting on the Russian government's behalf. Especially, and it's hard to believe that she was working on the Russian government's behalf when the person who wrote that email to Donald Jr. purporting to speak on behalf of the Russian government was Rob Goldstone, this British music publicist, who now says he made all that up in a bid to convince Don Jr. to take the meeting. And what the Mueller report omits was that Veselnitskaya was actually working with Fusion GPS, the firm behind the Steele dossier. And that's part of this pattern that I see here, and why I have skepticism of what U.S. intelligence officials portray us. I think there's a imperative to try to come up with a nefarious portrayal of Russia and Russian agents, when in fact there's no concrete evidence there of any actual Russian agents.
Well, I don't know how you reached that broad conclusion when you cited a couple efforts yourself of Russian government outreach to the Trump team. And let's, for a moment, just pause on the earliest outreach that's documented, that to George Papadopoulos. How was it that someone with ties to Russian intelligence was able to tell George Papadopoulos months in advance of the release of Hillary Clinton's emails and at the start of this broader hack and release campaign that the Russians had this in the works? Was it just good guesswork? Did this person have a crystal ball? Look, I think that, again, we can't mirror image how we know our own system works to how the Russian government works. Those who have long studied the Russians know that they enlist both government officials, private citizens, sort of quasi-private citizens like Natalia Veselnitskaya, in their efforts. And clearly this outreach to the Trump campaign through any and all avenues they could find was part, as has been documented by in both law enforcement and intelligence channels, was part of this broader Russian campaign.
What I'm saying is there is the suggestion that they're all acting on the Kremlin's behalf. There's never a concrete assertion that they are. Mueller never says that Joseph Mifsud, the example you've just given, who spoke to George Papadopoulos, Mueller never says that he was a Russian agent. He suggests that he might have been.
But that's not Mueller's job. That's not Mueller's job. I think you have to distinguish between intelligence assessments and law enforcement reports, documents, charging documents, the likes of which Mueller charged. It's not the job of a prosecutor to put forward an assessment without an associated criminal charge, or in the case of Mueller, a declination decision. It's the job of a prosecutor to lay out the case that is based on information that can be released publicly. That is to say, exclusively unclassified information. In this case, at least what we saw of the Mueller report, and really to go no further. For a number of reasons, but including to protect sources and methods. Now, the intelligence community has in some ways, a broader mandate. Their mandate is to speak to the plans, intentions, objectives of foreign actors. And in this case, they made very clear that this was a multifaceted operation in 2016, and we've heard it has continued since, ordered by Vladimir Putin himself, involving the several different tactics, one of which was outreach in multiple levels.
I'll just say they've never asserted that Joseph Mifsud was acting on the Russian government's behalf. And as Congress members pointed out to Mueller, Republican Congress members, of course, pointed out to Mueller at his testimony, Mueller omitted the Western ties of this guy, Joseph Mifsud. And Mueller also declined to explain why he didn't indict Joseph Mifsud, even though he says that Mifsud lied to his agents. And Mifsud was interviewed by the FBI in early 2017 in Washington. He was never formally accused of being a Russian agent, nor even indicted for lying, which I think raises unresolved questions that need to be answered.
And well, I would just say, if you're going to postulate that Mifsud was not a Russian agent himself, how was this information passed on to Papadopoulos? Did someone just have a crystal ball? Was it just good guesswork? That still doesn't explain how Papadopoulos, months in advance of the public release of much of this information, was in the know and in fact communicated that back.
Here's what we know. Alexander Downer, the Australian diplomat who relayed the Papadopoulos tip to the FBI, which sparked supposedly the entire Trump-Russia probe, Alexander Downer, by his own account, says that Papadopoulos did not say what it was that Mifsud said the Russians had. He didn't say stolen emails. It was incredibly vague. If by chance he did say stolen emails, if he did, according to Downer, he didn't. But if he did, then that could have been Mifsud trying to, basically looking at a public talking point at the time, which was these rumors that the Russians had Hillary Clinton's State Department emails. And for whatever reason, he was trying to impress Papadopoulos, and it looks like he was trying to gain favor with him because he saw him as an into the Trump campaign. Or there was something else going on more sinister, which I think is possible, that he basically repeated a public talking point. So even the predicate itself is very vague, and I think there's been this post facto attempt to make it seem more damning than it actually was. We talk about this troll farm. Well, Mueller recently had to admit that the troll farm, he has not found any actual evidence linking the troll farm to the Russian government, even though he suggested that it was a part of the sweeping and systematic Russian government interference campaign?
So again, Mueller's role was not to establish links between one entity to the next. That is the role of the intelligence community, and in fact, the IRA was mentioned with some prominence in the 2017 intelligence community assessment on Russia's efforts in 2016. So the fact that Mueller doesn't declare in his report that the IRA operated at the behest of Putin, in fact, I think that is to be expected. Once again, what Mueller put forward, at least in the unredacted portions of his report, was completely unclassified. It had to do with the decisions to charge or to decline to prosecute. And so that would have been neither here nor there for Mueller to say one way or the other.
The social media angle, when I look at these social media posts, I see a bunch of juvenile clickbait that even US Senate studies have acknowledged were mostly unrelated to the election. There was a relatively small amount of money spent on it, $100,000, most of that coming after the election. And most of the content is unrelated to the election. And then I hear people like Dan Coates talking about, for the midterm elections, the warning lights were blinking red. And there were all these dire terms about the midterms, but yet nothing happened in the midterms. And so this is where I'm asking, are you open to the fact that we've possibly inflated the Russian threat here?
Well, look, the goal of a psychological operation and a propaganda operation like this is to cause us to take actions we otherwise wouldn't have, and to cause the American population at large to take actions that they otherwise wouldn't have. I would quibble with the predicate of your question. I think the $100,000 figure you cited had more to do with purchased ads on Facebook and elsewhere, and not I think it was $12 million a month that the Internet Research Agency pumped into their propaganda efforts in the lead up to our 2016 election. I think it's undeniable that the propaganda effort was on a pretty enormous scale. If I recall, 126 million Americans were subject to the Facebook content alone. And of course, that doesn't include YouTube and Twitter and the other social media platforms on which this was active. You mentioned that not all of these ads mentioned Clinton or Trump. And I think if you take a look at the assessment of the Russian objectives in this, yes, it was to advance then candidate Trump's prospects for election. It was to denigrate Secretary Clinton, but it was also to pit Americans against each other. And it was to, in some ways, tear us apart at the seams. And so to play into divisive issues like gun control and gun rights, racial equality, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ issues, more recently Take a Knee and other movements that have social contours to them, that was part of the strategic objective as well. And look, we can never quantify just how successful a campaign like this was. We don't know how many people's minds it changed in 2016. But certainly America has been a more politicized and polarized society. And I think the very least we can say is that efforts like this contribute to the vitriol and to the polarization and division that we have seen in our country, especially since 2016.
We'll have to agree to disagree. I don't see how juvenile social media ads with Jesus arm wrestling memes and Buff Bernie memes and masturbation memes and Yosemite Sam memes, how they could possibly contribute to polarization in an already very polarized country where I think problems are homegrown. I don't see how Russia, with silly ads, could play a role in that, especially if, when you talk about millions of dollars, they had an overall budget of I think a few $1,000,000 a month, but the American component of that was only a subsection. And this figure about 126 million people, Facebook said that it was up to 126 million people, and even that was a spin on their own guess. It was based on an estimation of how many times these stories appear in people's Facebook feeds. But again, it's an example I see of taking figures and making it into a bigger threat than they actually are. I'll give you the last word on this topic, and then we'll move on to Iran before I let you go.
Well, look, I think you put it well. We'll have to agree to disagree. I think that look, we would be deluding ourselves if we could say that we will be successful in preventing or deterring efforts like this in the future. But I think it behooves us, it behooves our entire government, both a whole of government approach to ensure that adversaries like Russia, and I will agree with you on one point, look, we have to cooperate with Russia on key issues. Just because they are adversarial to us in important and profound ways doesn't mean we can ignore arms control, doesn't mean we can ignore the work we have to do with North Korea, with climate change, with other shared challenges. But we are big enough and powerful enough that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And that means that we can also prepare our defenses here and take action to mitigate Russia's very clear and I think well-documented efforts to interfere in our political society.